Hi, John. It's great to be back in college again. I'm Maura, as you know, Maura Briscoe, and this is John Latham from the class of 1978. And we've had a fun time in Dublin so far with the sun shining today. What could be better?
Absolutely, Maura. It's been a brilliant week so far. And yeah, last night was pretty wet, but the sun has been shining most of the time.
Yeah.
Wonderful to meet classmates. And
Yeah,
lovely to meet you again, Maura.
Thank you.
It really is.
And from all over the world, our classmates of 1978, from South Africa, from Canada, from America. Amazing, the travel that people put in to really show their appreciation of their time in the college. And it surprised me, John, how many people actually said that to me yesterday, how they loved being an undergraduate in the college. So we're going to talk about you now, John. Tell us how you made the decision to do medicine in RCSI.
Well, Maura, like many things in life, it didn't quite come about by accident, but almost by default. When I was a little boy, my heroes were pilots and Navy officers and adventurous people like that. And until I was 14, I really wanted and thought I would be either a pilot or more likely in the Navy. But at the age of 14, it was discovered that I was very short-sighted. Up until 14, my eyesight was perfect.
Right.
And then, unfortunately, I had to go to my mother whisked me to an optician, and my ambitions to be at least a deck officer on a ship were gone.
Right.
So
were you devastated?
I was a bit. I think my mother was more devastated, actually. Why did I want to do medicine? I couldn't think of anything else. My dad was an engineer, and he'd got into the business side. You know, he was in administration. And that seemed to me such an awful task. People were always fighting with one another in business. And I thought, I don't want to go anywhere near business or commerce or anything like that.
Okay.
So,
but didn't you have some historical context with the College of Surgeons?
I only discovered, actually after graduation, that my great-great-grandfather was professor of anatomy, actually, here, for a long time. Between 1851 and 1880 or something like that.
Wow. 1851 to 1880.
A very long time.
Wow.
Now, I didn't realise that while I was here. And he'd been dead for so long that my mum didn't even... She knew he'd been a surgeon, but she hadn't any...
And what was his name, John?
His name was Philip Bevan.
Bevan?
Yeah.
Right.
Not a very prominent... Not like... Abraham Collis or one of these extremely famous chaps. He just was a quiet surgeon, got on with it, and hopefully he taught anatomy very well for 30 years.
Well, yes, I'm sure he did.
And I guess if we went into the anatomy lab, we might still find some remnant of his work. I don't know, some dissections or something like that. I don't know.
Very good, John. Very good.
There we are.
There you're following in distinguished
But
footsteps.
I didn't realise it, you see, until afterwards.
Yeah. So you, like me, did various hospital stints around Dublin. And you, like me, worked in the Rotunda and we worked in Temple Street.
Yes.
I loved the Rotunda and Temple Street.
Yeah.
Did you like it?
I really enjoyed it. And maybe it would be nice to maybe compare notes on the Rotunda.
Okay, yeah.
I actually did 6 months as an obstetrics SHO and enjoyed that. But I knew I didn't want to be an obstetrician gynecologist, but I was delighted to have done it. And then the chance came up to do neonatology with a chap called Tom Matthews. You'll remember him.
I do.
He was actually, I think, the first neonatology specialist in Ireland.
Yeah.
He was.
Well, I
think.
did a similar thing. I did Obs and Gynae first, and I loved that. And I remember Dalrymple.
Yes,
and then
the Dali.
and then Dr. Henry became master. George Henry. And what I really liked about the place was, generally speaking, the happy atmosphere, because women, generally speaking, when they're pregnant, are not sick.
No.
So, you had all this crack from inner Dublin mainly, and I just loved all that. And there was a real sense of team with the midwives, etc., in the place. So having coffee with everybody off the labour ward, it was just a great place.
You obviously enjoyed it as much as I did.
I thought it was great, so much so that I did neonatology after that as well. Yeah. And Tom Matthews was, I would say, a superb teacher.
Lovely teacher, lovely man and a great teacher.
And a great teacher. And he would come down and sit with all of us for lunch. No ceremony with him at all.
Very informal.
So, I thought it was a great place. And of course, I really like Conway's across the road as well.
We won't go into some of the details of the extraordinary thing that people drank on duty. Now, I personally didn't overdrink or anything, but it was extraordinary, wasn't it?
It was extraordinary that...
That was the culture, wasn't it? Did you find that very odd?
I did, and I'm a very good girl, you see,
I know,
John.
you didn't drink anything.
I
Tonic water, probably.
Tonic water, yes, probably. But there was a time when you go over to Conway's just before it closed, because if you were a junior doctor on duty, you could go to bed unless there was a caesarean section in the middle of the night, and you knew more or less when there was going to be a caesarean section. But oddly enough, John, I have a painting of the interior of Conway's pub, which is now closed, of course, in my living room. A huge thing, and I love it.
And
I mean,
who painted it, Maura?
Who painted? Now you're testing my knowledge. I'll come back to that. McElnay. McElnay is. I have a number of his works, but that's when I saw it, I thought I have to get that, and it's a big thing. Covers nearly one wall of my living room, so it's lovely. So you went to Temple Street, and I did too. But we didn't. We weren't there together.
We must have avoided one another by a year or something.
That wasn't by design, John.
Before I went to the Rotunda, I did. SHO in Connolly Hospital in Blanchardstown.
Okay.
And very nearly took a pathology job of all things.
Wow.
Because I worked for a cardiologist called Michael O'Reilly.
Okay.
An unusual chap. Very, very good cardiologist, but an unusual character. And after a number of our patients, sadly deceased, he did want some autopsy results, and there weren't always people to carry out post-mortems. There weren't enough pathologists around. So I would be sent down to the autopsy room, and with a technician, I would slice open hearts and look for thromboses and odd things like that. And actually, strangely enough, quite enjoyed it.
And you were a first-year SHO?
Yes, totally unqualified to be doing it.
Those were the days, John.
And I just report back to him, yes, I think there was a thrombosis in the anterior coronary artery or something like that.
Amazing.
And then I wasn't sure where my next SHO post would be. So before the end of my 6 months, the pathology department said, would you like to become a pathology SHO? And it was sort of tempting because, I needed a job.
Yeah.
But instead I went to Daisy Hill.
Well, you went north and I went north. I went after after I qualified to Galvin Hospital.
Oh, wow.
And I did
Great hospital.
medicine and geriatric medicine there. And that was another great place.
Yeah.
Albeit that the troubles
Yes.
and the distress to families and all of that
Exactly,
were very apparent in, for example, A&E and that sort of thing. I did enjoy myself there, and and finally, of course, I live in Belfast now.
Yes.
But that's another story.
Well, yes, indeed.
Yeah. So you went to Daisy Hill, and what did you do in Daisy Hill in Newry?
I was an SHO again. It was my second job post-internship, and it was, if you like, I really felt out of my depth because there was an SHO, there were no interns, there was no registrar, and my consultant lived in Castleknock, so he wasn't there very much. Certainly not out of hours.
Yeah.
So incredible responsibility, and it was on take for heart failure and MIs and strokes and goodness knows what else.
Yeah, but great
amazing
terrible training
it was
in one
terrifying in one
yes,
sense.
yeah.
And as I tell people, I don't think I was responsible for any premature deaths, but that's only by the grace of God, really.
I know.
But by golly, I learned a lot of, not just medicine, but an attitude of how to deal with serious conditions and make, decision making.
Decision making, yeah.
That was great.
Well, I thought my time in the Rotunda, looking at very small babies and with parents and all that, and then moving on to Temple Street. Yes. And I worked in A&E in Temple Street, and I thought, saw really a lot of general practice in Temple Street, and that was wonderful training as well. Yeah, I got all my notes taken one time in Temple Street.
Oh,
I was driving out from the car park late at night, and somebody bashed my window and took my notes, but actually they were left back to me. Isn't that great?
But that is, it was a real North Inner City, and as you say, it was like being a massive general practice because mums and dads brought children in with anything and everything, coughs and colds. And I'm sure you found that the skill you learned there was how to tell the staff and the parents that the child was well enough to go home.
Yeah.
And that's the real skill of primary care.
Absolutely.
Knowing when, skill in knowing when somebody's really ill, but actually being able to tell a mother, no, actually you can go home.
Yeah. And you saw how immediately, really very soon after the child came in, once they got some paracetamol and got their temperature down a bit, how children improve so quickly. Yeah. So you trained then to be a GP.
Yeah.
And then you went into inner city Dublin amongst other things as well, maybe.
Yeah,
but
I did. In those days, it was almost impossible to get onto a structured GP training course in Ireland. There were very few places. So I did my own structured hospital work, which included what we just discussed, and the Rotunda and Temple Street. And I went to Edinburgh for a 1 year GP training. And so I really had no idea what general practice was like at all. I got no undergraduate experience. It was available in RCSI, but it was voluntary. And instead of doing the voluntary GP attachment, I said no, and I worked on building sites and made enough money to have a holiday and things like that. So I have to admit that.
Well, I told you I was a good girl. So
I was a bad boy.
Yeah, so myself and Pauline Gaskin, when we were in RCSI, we took ourselves off in my Volkswagen Beetle up to Donegal to a practice in Burton
a
Port.
chap called Bonner, was it?
But Bonner and Dodo Sweeney in Burton Port, and that was an eye-opener for me.
Dr. Bonner was actually a really... I met him a few times, but I'd love to have worked...
Bonner.
Declan,
yeah. And that was a real eye-opener for me, because they had a few beds in a cottage hospital. They had a vast variety of patients all around Donegal. It was just amazing.
A lot of driving involved.
A lot of driving. And they put us up above the surgery, in a flat above the surgery, and they were so good to us. And that influenced my life.
Yeah.
And that was organised via the College of Surgeons.
Because later on you did become a general practitioner for 10 years, but
I did.
You may want to talk about that later.
Well, like you said, it's interesting that you said you really didn't think you'd get on to a GP training practice in Ireland. I felt the same way. And in fact, I felt as a woman, not a chance. It was just in its infancy, the GP training schemes in Ireland. And I felt as a woman, there isn't a chance of me getting on one of these very precious places.
Yeah.
So I took myself off to Northern Ireland. And I think the only reason I got onto the GP training scheme in Northern Ireland was it was a terrible winter's day. The snow was falling down, and I drove from Dublin up to Belfast for an interview.
Yeah.
And they were so surprised that anybody managed to get up from Dublin, because there were so many cancellations, people not coming across the Glenshane Pass, etc., that, probably did an okay interview, but boy, were they impressed. And actually, my windscreen wiper broke on the car, on my Volkswagen Beetle. So one of the interviewers heard me speak to the receptionist to ask, how can I get my windscreen wiper repaired before I go drive back to Dublin in the snow? So I think that's why I got on the GP training scheme in Northern Ireland.
I'm sure you sparkled and did a very good interview. It's very modest of you to say that that's the only reason. But obviously they were impressed by your grit, determination, and your adventurous spirit. Crossing a border in snow. Well done.
So that was 1982.
Yep.
So I ended up as a GP in a wonderful practice in Armagh City. And I didn't know it at the time that I actually put a pin in the map and said, where can I drive that would bring me back to Dublin? I don't mean quickly, just for weekends and that sort of thing. And I landed in a most amazing practice with Dr. Woods, Oliver Woods, as my trainer, and Patrick Kellett, who went to Trinity, but we won't talk about Patrick. But both of them, and Gary O'Reilly, all of them delightful. And I stayed 10 years there.
And Maura, before we spoke, you gave me a few little, if you like, waypoints in your life. And is it too early in our conversation to say that you mentioned you met an Englishman somewhere? And tell me a bit more right now.
Well, I met Peter. I was actually working in Armagh when I met Peter, and we used to go out in a big group, and we went horse riding outside Belfast in a big group, and me and horses are not compatible. Really, are not.
Do they buck you off? Do you fall off them?
Yes, because I want to be in control, and the horse doesn't like that. No. But he could ride all right. So he was the typical South of England, nice accents, British boy. Yeah. And then we were all saying, right, we'll go to a restaurant in Belfast for a meal and see you all at 9 o'clock. Yeah. He arrived at 9. Nobody else was there for about another half an hour. But and then he became, much to his horror, the GP's husband, because I stayed for 10 years. We have some funny stories on that.
Yes,
but
sure.
that was not a good experience for
being
him.
a GP spouse in those days was tough, and I'm sure my wife Linda would.
Yeah.
Particularly when you were on call at all hours of day and night.
Yeah.
And there were no mobile phones. Patients used to phone your house.
Yeah.
You might have had a pager, perhaps.
No, I didn't have a pager, and we had such a wide area to cover in rural Armagh, and that was the time of the Troubles, so going through checkpoints, etc., etc. So, but I always felt safe in Armagh.
Because everyone knew who you were.
And everybody knew who we were, and I, coming from Dublin, I didn't understand that. So in my first week, I was walking down a street in Armagh City, and I dropped a coin on the ground, and the man behind me picked it up and said, "Here you are, Dr. Briscoe." That is one of my first memories from Armagh, that everybody knew who I was, and everybody knew what, of course, the army and police did as well, what car you drove.
Yeah. That's great.
So are you a deprived doctor, John?
Well, I would be described as my eventual practice. You did ask me how I got into inner city practice, I think. Strangely enough, my ambition was to become a country doctor. Maybe not that I rode horses, but the idea of having a horse in a paddock somewhere nearby and wearing a nice tweed jacket and so on and so forth. That was my sort of romantic idea of general practice life. But having done some very long locums, single-handed locums for people who'd either passed away or were ill in Wexford and in Carlow, really busy GMS, that's public practices, with the full 2,000 patients and single-handed, and no secretaries, no nurses. And in one case, absolutely no records.
Gosh.
And in those days, after you'd done your long locum, you would, with others, apply to the health board. In this case, it was South Eastern Health Board for the permanent post. And in each case, I was told I was too inexperienced. Somebody else got the job. So I ended up, by default, almost by accident, doing a locum for an inner city doctor in the Liberties, a place called the Corn Market, which is just off Thomas Street. And he said, "Thank goodness you're here. The last time I tried to go on holiday, the locum was a lady army doctor, and after the first day she fainted and the patients had to carry her out." And I could see why she fainted. It was an old-fashioned practice where maybe 50, 60 or even 70 patients would file past the doctor. It was the fee per item system was still working in the GMS. So the more patients you saw, the more you got paid. So they barely sat in a chair for more than 2 minutes and were up with a prescription, of course.
Yeah.
And that was so common in Ireland back in the early 80s. Virtually no GP had vocational training, as you possibly know. You knew. You knew a few people of our generation, like yourself, but the stalwarts of general practice had. They were, first of all, they weren't vocationally trained. Secondly, they weren't supported by health boards or Department of Health in any way. There was no college of GPs in the early 80s. So it was very different territory. And I ended up working with this chap for the next 10 years.
Wow. And you must have seen some really horrendous things there. Poverty, really.
Yeah. Poverty, both physical poverty and the poverty that you get from lack of education, early school leaving, very early single motherhood,
Yeah.
single motherhood, early pregnancies. And of course, early 80s was when the heroin epidemic began. And it was also when HIV came in, well, into many, well, pretty well all cities in Europe, but particularly in that part of Dublin.
Yeah.
So it was like a war zone. Now that I look back at it, it really was.
I know. Well, my experience as a trainee was very different.
Yeah.
Because I worked in a health centre.
Yes.
There were 8,000 patients. There were, when I came as a trainee, there were 3 partners, and the mother of one of the partners still working there.
Right.
And they had sort of what was originally Armagh City Hospital.
Yeah.
So we had beds in this sort of downgraded hospital.
And you could do minor surgery.
We could do minor surgery there. And the obstetrician, who was a great man called Robin Wallace, used to come into the health centre every week because he did an outpatient clinic in Armagh City Hospital. And he'd go around the practices and he would know, you'd have told his secretary if you were worried about somebody, obs and gynae, and you got instant consultant opinion. That was service.
That was before its time.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
And of course, the community nurse was just down the corridor. The social workers at our weekly practice meeting, we had the social workers there, we had the practice nurse there, and we had the health visitor there. So that was really before its time.
Yeah. So the NHS was well ahead of the posse.
Yeah.
Both in the UK and obviously in Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
And it's
you
amazing where we've come in Ireland since then.
Absolutely.
Oh, it's extraordinary. And it is thanks to some of the people who are just a little bit older than us, who, you know, people like James McCormack, who you probably remember, Michael Boland.
Absolutely.
You probably remember him or heard of him.
Yeah.
Bill Shannon.
Bill Shannon, very
Fantastic
famous.
Man.
Yeah.
He was the first prof of general practice in this college.
Yeah.
So I very nearly went back to the UK because I didn't think there was any future for there wasn't going to be a possibility to practice proper general practice in Ireland because it was unsupported. Most people were working in single-handed practices, etc., etc. But luckily, things began to improve.
So how did you manage nighttime calls then, if you were in inner city Dublin?
Yeah. Well, there was a very strange system called Doctor on Call.
Okay.
And when I look back at it, it was not a terribly good system. But the chap I worked with for 10 years, he relied on this system. So after a particular time, I think it was probably 6 in the evening, your patients would ring Doctor on Call, and somebody, and sometimes including me when I needed a bit of extra cash for the mortgage, would do house calls, so-called emergency house calls. And I earned a little bit of extra money by doing that in extraordinary places like Ballymun and Tala.
And did you get someone to mind your car at all outside your surgery?
My car was definitely broken into more than once.
Yeah.
It was never actually stolen, but I remember the steering wheel was smashed, so I couldn't drive it on one occasion.
Wow.
But that was part of the experience. So that also, I did an on-call rota with some. I lived and still do live in Goatstown near Dundrum, in Dublin 14, and again, there were extremely tough times financially. The early 80s, or even for the whole 1980s. Interest rates were 16%, etc. So I found myself doing an on-call rota with more South Dublin GPs, with patients calling to my house and so on and so forth.
Gosh.
it was a very unfair rota because they weren't on call for my practice in the inner city.
Yeah.
But again, it was interesting.
Yeah.
And one had to do what one had to do
Yeah.
to keep the bread on the table.
Yeah.
I mean, it was tough.
It was tough. It was.
Yeah.
But I'm sure you, like me, I really loved my patients.
Yeah.
I really loved the
Yeah.
patients.
Yeah.
And I really felt that even though I was an outsider into Armagh, you got to know, you realised very quickly that everybody was related to everybody else in Armagh.
Yeah.
And that was very important to get the connections right as you saw the patient, because really understanding the family really gave you an insight into the patient sitting in front of you.
Yeah.
And I think in a way, maybe that's a bit missing now, do you think?
I don't know. I often prefer to call general practice family medicine because, you know, you are looking after, yes, individuals, but they're in the milieu of their family. And actually, I'm reminded of this because my younger daughter is now, her profession is a family therapist, psychotherapist. And she reckons any in her particular role, it is impossible, say, to look after a teenager unless you also know the mum, the dad, the brother, the uncles, the aunts. And in the inner city, of course, like Armagh, so many people are related.
Yes, of course.
And that was very important, of course, during the terrible HIV and heroin epidemic, when so many of the young parents just died in front of you.
Gosh.
On at least 2 occasions, I did a house calls to young women who obviously had pneumonia, had all the typical classical signs of pneumonia, fever, breathlessness, crackly chest, and all the rest of it, and sent them into James's Hospital. This is 2 specific patients, both mothers of very young children, and each of them died within about a week of being admitted of AIDS, HIV. And this is in the early 80s, before antiretrovirals. And then you had this little family of babies and children, and the granny would take over. And so many there are generations of young, middle-aged people in where my practice was, who were brought up by their grannies, and sometimes their granddads as well. And they were very strong families. And what they put up with, I mean, apart from the appalling, erratic behaviour of their children, who were going mad with drugs and were suffering from the effects of this awful addiction, which is a terrible illness. They then end up looking after being the sole carer for their grandchildren.
Well, in contrast, in the 80s, working in Armagh and all sort of paramilitary involvement, etc., I really didn't see much drug abuse or HIV.
I know.
But and of course, being a female doctor, generally speaking, women gravitate towards female doctors for
quite rightly, I would think.
Conditions.
Yeah.
And I always felt that the unspoken word, when women come in and they're stressed and they're anxious, whatever, really the unspoken word that they couldn't tell you really what was going on was much more important than what you saw in front of you, and very sad sometimes too.
I was very fortunate in that my wife Linda, once I finished in my first practice and moved into my own, if you like, started up my own practice 10 years after moving into the inner city. And she became, first of all, practice nurse and then advanced nurse practitioner.
Very good, John.
Then she did her doctorate and she was prescribing. And of course, as you were saying, just as you were telling me about women coming to you, the women really communicated with her.
Yeah.
And both unspoken and spoken.
Yeah.
And of course, we didn't have paramilitary, but we did have another type of armed conflict.
Yes.
Which sadly took, again, that was another thing that took lives of our young patients. Either knife or bullet.
Wow.
But from their own community, would you
Yeah.
believe? Not from
Yeah.
the type of thing that was going on in the north of Ireland. And that continues to this day, actually.
Yeah.
And that, but we were, again, rather like you and your colleagues in Armagh, you were on neither one side nor the other, and you're respected by all.
Yeah.
I think. And we were too. I mean, we had people whose families had suffered, in fact, maybe had family members killed, and they knew. They tried not to be in the waiting room at the same time, and we hoped that they wouldn't be.
No. Yeah.
But it was rather strange, and it still is, and very sad.
Sad.
Yeah.
So moving on then, John, you owned your own may not be the right word, but you created your own practice.
You may remember early in our conversation, I said I didn't want to go into the business world or the commerce.
Yes.
I ended up owning a business, running a small business, which is, I believe, still the best model for general practice. Not everybody thinks that, and some younger doctors don't feel that they aspire to the responsibility of small entrepreneurship, which is what I ended up involved in. And it was okay, and I was very fortunate to be in the right place at the right time. The GMS system in this country is a very good system for. Now it's had its faults. We've had to fight our battles, but in general, it's a really good way of funding general practice. And colleagues who haven't really been exposed to the GMS often feel, oh, you're not in control, the government is going to be interfering with the department. I'm so pleased, again, but not out of my own doing, that I really almost have done no private medicine in my whole life.
Well, I can honestly say I've done no private medicine.
Well,
no,
I think
zero.
we're privileged not to.
Yeah.
And I think the worry of that, the uncertainty of the private world would have actually been difficult. But there we go.
So you retired in 2019,
I
John.
did. Yeah.
And tell me how you spend your time now and what you've done since 2019.
I decided, I was very fortunate to have two partners I could hand over the practice to. And shortly after, another trainee who was obviously going to be the third partner. And so it was very easy to hand over to a really good team who I'd already worked with and knew really well, and had the same heart for the community that I had, possibly even more so. I think they're brilliant, the three young doctors I've handed over to. And having had a good chat with them recently, for instance, they're working extremely hard, but they're enjoying it. And unusually, they are able to take on any new patient who wishes to join the practice, which is not the case in most of areas of Ireland. If you move into an area and look for a GP, usually the practice will say, I'm sorry, we're closed.
Yes,
but
indeed.
Not our own practice. Anyway.
Well, that's a great legacy to have.
Thomas Court is the name of the practice I left.
Very good.
Anyway, I finished my clinical work, and again, by default, I never aspired to do this, but I was asked, would I like to head up a new GP training scheme or family medicine training scheme in Malaysia?
Wow.
And I thought, but I'm not an administrator. I've never been involved in, well, I'd administered this small team.
Yeah.
But this was a national training scheme, which was just starting. And it began in October 2019. And I went out in January 2020. And I had a contract for 2 years. And so we started with 34 young Malaysian doctors who are about to graduate after their four years in a couple of months' time. So they're following a very similar, in fact, almost a mirror image of the Irish vocational training scheme, obviously contextualized to
So
Malaysia.
These were postgraduates?
Yes, these are postgraduates. So they're doing their 2 years in hospital, their 2 years in practice, and they're doing the MICGP exam, just as their Irish colleagues over here are doing, and at exactly the same time.
Fab. That's great. That's great.
And one of the attractions for them is that it isn't MICGP in brackets Malaysia. It is MICGP as if you had done your training in Ireland.
Yeah. And what about equality for women in terms of access to that training program, John?
Well, unlike your feelings in 1982, of course, women make up the majority of trainees in Ireland, and even more so in Malaysia.
Is that right?
Yeah, and most of the trainers, all of the program directors and assistant program directors that were there and who I recruited during my time, bar one, there was one man. They're all powerful, excellent women doctors.
That's great to hear.
There are very few vocationally trained family physicians in Malaysia, but those that are there are all women. And they're strong, determined, and they're so ambitious to get the program going. They're a joy to work with. They really are.
Isn't that great?
They really are.
And did you enjoy, like leaving aside medicine, did you enjoy living in Malaysia?
Loved it.
And your wife was there with you?
She absolutely was in her element. Linda's a very outgoing person, and she made friends instantly by joining a gym, for instance, and the church we went to, we made friends through that, and so on and so forth. And although after 3 months, COVID clamped down on everything. And of course, there were restrictions, and then they were lifted, and there were restrictions. But within the bounds of that, we had a really good social life, I have to say.
Great.
And we look forward to going back there sometime to catch up with them.
Great. Well, other than medicine now, you started saying that you thought when you were 14 you might like to be a naval officer. But I do know you sail a lot now.
I'm an amateur sailor now.
And you take beautiful photographs of the coastline of Ireland. Wow. So how far have you travelled sailing, John?
Not very far. I suppose I was lucky when I was younger that my dad sailed a bit. And I also knew when I was a student, I knew some people with nice cruising boats. And while I was a student, I think it's right to say that I did a little bit of sailing in the Baltic and a fair bit in the west of Scotland. But since, in recent years, I've done a circumnavigation of Ireland.
Have you really?
And that is just, we live on the most amazing island. And from the land, it is beautiful, but boy,
from the sea,
when you see every bit of the coast, particularly the Atlantic coast, the Wild Atlantic Way is brilliant. From
the sea.
Yeah, well, it's lovely from the land, but from the sea, it is just so dramatic and beautiful. Yeah. So, what about you? What have you? I believe you play bridge. Is that right?
I play bridge. Yes.
Yeah. You don't ride horses anymore.
I certainly don't ride any horses, but I do play tennis 8 times a week in the winter time.
8 times a week?
8 times a week.
Wow.
Now, it's only...
That's more than once a
day.
Each day,
Yeah. I take Thursday off from tennis. Right. But you have to understand, John, it's ladies' tennis, and there's a big chat element of that
course,
at the net, so it's a big part of my social life. But I do enjoy it.
Yeah.
We go to St. Lucia every year to play tennis, which is very nice and, very special.
Lovely.
What else do? I'm trying to play golf. I do try and play
My
golf.
mother who played golf, she always said, I tried to play.
Yes,
But you do play.
Oh, I do play. Yes, I am a member of a golf club and I do play and I do enjoy that. Sadly, I don't enjoy the handicap committee, but that's another story. So tennis and golf and bridge, but bridge is a constant learning opportunity.
Yes, it is.
It's a very humbling game. Lots to learn on that. But the funny thing is, and I'll stop soon, but the funny thing is, so I play bridge in Belfast in the club, in the tennis club with my partner, Rosemary Black. And our teacher in Kelvin Malone, which is a great club, felt we needed more experience. This is Rosemary and I needed more experience. Right. And of course, Zoom and Bridge Base Online and all these things give you more opportunities. He got in contact with somebody in Sligo and organised for us to play bridge we play bridge on a Monday night in Belfast and we play bridge on a Tuesday night in Sligo.
Face to face or by Zoom?
But on Bridge Base.
Oh, Bridge Base.
Through the club in Sligo. Right. How about that?
That is amazing.
Yes, isn't that great?
Yeah.
But so I do a tiny little bit of work that interests me.
Right.
Haven't seen a patient though in years, but at least the little bit that I do keeps me in contact.
We haven't actually talked about your subsequent very important career in public health. Have you time to give me a little...
Well, I worked for 2 chief medical officers in Northern Ireland and they were incredibly good to me and offered me great opportunity to see a breadth of medicine and indeed social care.
Yeah.
And of course, Northern Ireland has an integrated health and social care system. And I think that's very important. So, I did various roles relating to safety, quality and standards. Then I moved from medicine altogether onto the policy side and became Director of Mental Health and Disability. And just for good measure, Director of Older People was thrown into that portfolio along with developing mental capacity legislation and sexual and domestic violence. So I have seen...
What a range.
What a range, indeed.
But unlike me, you had some training in administration. You did an MBA.
I did an MBA in health and social care. But really...
Did you find that valuable?
I learned...
Was it worthwhile?
Yes, I think it was. Because it was in health and social care, I met lots of people who were on the social care element of health services, and also, a vast array of people who were chiropodists, physios, etc. And I learned how to write, John. That was very important to me. Because of all these things that you had to present and write and that, I learned how to write and I learned how to present, which was a life skill for me.
It is,
Yes,
And, I haven't mentioned it, but writing has been an enormous part of my life.
Has it really?
I was responsible for a monthly column in the ICGP Journal Forum for about 22 years. So I had to produce 1,000 words every month for 22 years.
Gosh.
And also again, by default, I certainly didn't apply for the job of editorship, but for about 8 or 9 years, I was editor of the journal as well.
Yeah.
So there are two different types of writing. I also did some, I'm not an academic, so I haven't written any learned papers, but I was given the opportunity to write health-related stuff.
Wonderful.
Distance learning modules and things like that.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you found that discipline it's very good for sorting your mental state out apart from anything else.
And of course, my daughter, when she was a child, hated me when I corrected her punctuation all the time because I was so drilled in it. But it's interesting now, she actually appreciates that now.
So she's probably she does put her apostrophes in the right place, does she?
Correct. Well, John, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and you've had a wonderful career in medicine, and I'm sure inner city Dublin has hugely benefited from all your work there, and of course Malaysia as well. I want to, but you were nearly like an ad for Fáilte Ireland there for a few minutes. So I want to ask you, at the end, you sailed around the coast of Ireland, and everything was beautiful from both land and sea.
Indeed.
If you're coming into a harbour, which harbour would you think is the most beautiful to come into? Tough question.
It's so difficult. So many of them are wonderful. I love coming into Dingle Harbour.
Love it too, yeah.
Now, the last time I did it, Fungi was still alive, so we were welcomed. I believe Fungi has disappeared.
He has disappeared,
so
yes.
It's a beautiful entrance. The islands are just incredible.
Yeah.
Coming into Kilronan on Inishmore is absolutely gorgeous. And passing between the islands.
Super.
I love Baltimore.
You love Baltimore.
Wonderful.
Very good. Well, I'd say my favourite island is Innisboffin.
Yes.
And bird watching on Innisboffin. It is. Walking down the old bog road on Inishboffin is a wonderful experience.
I've never landed on it. I've sailed past it and said, next time we'll have to have time. I haven't yet.
Okay.
So you have had an amazing career too.
Medicine's been very good to me.
And you have been very good to it. You've said that the inner city, I've been very good for the inner city. I would say mostly the other way around. How good it has been for me, personally, and my family.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, you've a career almost in two parts. In a sense. Two specialties. Not many people, you've encompassed two specialties.
Well, I wouldn't say, I can't say I became a consultant in public health medicine, but I did a lot on policy and community stuff. Yeah, I did. And portfolio career is how I would end it. Yes, yeah.
Great.
Okay, great to talk to you, John.
And you too, Maura.
And
thanks very much.
Enjoy the future.
Thank you.
Until we meet again.
Exactly.